Your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission.
And from the air, it's clearly a bad one. A band of flames stretching along the entire coast of the Eyre Peninsula.
There is no firefighting force in the world that can stop the fire in the conditions we experience today.
Already the blaze has burned through tens of thousands of hectares, destroying properties along its path, with the township of North Shields near Port Lincoln reportedly among the worst hit. Among the dead were 3 people found burned to death in a car in the seaside town of Punindi. A number of other people are listed as missing. The fires first broke out last night on the lower west coast but were contained. But high temperatures and blustery winds this morning fanned the flames right across the peninsula.
The speed that it was coming and the smoke, you just had to move. My husband told me to pack a few things in the car, pick up my Jack Russell dog and get out.
Residents from at least one township, Louth Bay, were forced to seek refuge on a beach, while others fled their homes at Edalili, Wanilla and Wangari.
I was driving home, my kids were next door with Gay, and I saw the smoke and I knew it was right here.
I went down the driveway to the house, but the smoke was too thick, you couldn't see anything. And one of the CFS guys said, look, the flames are just down there, it's time to clear out.
Elsewhere, a fire in the Adelaide Hills has burnt out several hundred hectares. Some residents of Mount Osmond had to evacuate, but the blaze is now under control. With forecasts of more hot, dry and windy conditions to come, those living further west on the peninsula may not have seen the worst.
And joining me now live on the line from Adelaide is Andrew Lawson of the Country Fire Service. Andrew, good evening to you. What's the latest you can tell us? Is that fire still out of control?
The fire on the west coast on the Eyre Peninsula of South Australia is not yet contained. Our crews are working very hard this evening and will be working all night to contain that fire.
So can you tell us what the conditions are like at this time?
Fortunately, the conditions right across South Australia has moderated significantly, so the temperatures have reduced and the wind speed has reduced significantly, but there are still concerns with the winds in the south-southwest on the west coast, causing the fire to move in a northerly direction.
We're reporting tonight, Andrew, that 8 people are dead and then there are fears for others. Can you update us on those figures?
I can certainly confirm that we have reports of 8 confirmed deaths as a result of this fire, which is very, very unfortunate. However, I'm not able to confirm the number of people still missing. I believe it to be very low, fortunately, 3 or 4 persons that are still missing.
And what's the road ahead? What's the weather going to be like tomorrow?
Fortunately, tomorrow is going to be relatively mild, so the weather conditions, temperature is going to be lower, about 25 to 27, and the wind speeds are going to be relatively low as well. However, we're preparing for the weather conditions to worsen again on Thursday and Friday.
Thanks for joining us. That's Andrew Lawson of the Country Fire Service in South Australia. And there are fears that the bushfire danger could spread to central and western New South Wales tomorrow. Soaring temperatures and dry conditions are being forecast, similar to what South Australia experienced today, creating a high risk of bushfires. Well, within the past hour, the Attorney-General, Philip Ruddock, has announced that Australian Guantanamo Bay detainee Mamdouh Habib will be freed after nearly 3 years in custody. Mr. Ruddock made the announcement after the United States said there was insufficient evidence to bring charges against the Egyptian-born Australian. The United States had accused Mr. Habib of having connections to Al-Qaeda and says it still believes he had prior knowledge of the September the 11th attacks. But Mr. Ruddock says Mr. Habib is unlikely to be charged once he returns, as Australia's anti-terrorism laws cannot be applied retrospectively.
Mr. Habib will return to Australia and on the advice available to us, there are no charges that can be brought against him and he will be released. But as I said, he remains of interest in a security context because of his former associations and activities.
The federal government is attempting to ease concerns that Australians providing aid to tsunami-ravaged Aceh could be the target of separatists or Islamic militants. The Foreign Minister is rejecting opposition calls for Australia to provide its own protection for soldiers and aid workers in the troubled Indonesian province. It comes as an Australian Navy vessel heads to Aceh to help with relief efforts.
Loaded with 400 personnel and 780 tonnes of equipment, the HMAS Kanimbla is en route to tsunami-affected areas of Aceh. This is Operation Sumatra Assist, the mission to join the 460 Australian troops already working to restore infrastructure in the devastated region.
We'll be facing something, I suspect, that looks like chaos. It'll almost be primordial.
Certainly a challenge for Australian troops, but the federal opposition is raising grave concerns for their safety. A separatist war and the presence of Islamic hardliners in the region has led to fears of attacks on Australian troops and aid workers.
This area, Aceh, has always been difficult from a basic security point of view. The Aceh separatist movement's been at work for a long, long time.
Mr Rudd will visit Indonesia next week to investigate for himself the security arrangements in place to protect Australians involved with the tsunami relief effort. The Australian government is hosing down Labor's concerns and is shrugging off the threat of confrontation with a growing number of Islamist relief workers also rushing into the area.
It would seem almost inconceivable to us that a terrorist arm of such a group would take the opportunity of such a disaster to inflict another message.
Indonesia expert Dr Harold Crouch agrees the threat posed by either GUM separatists or Islamists is minimal.
In the case of clashes between the Indonesian military and GUM, they're likely to be taking place in areas other than where the Australian aid workers are. In the case of militant fundamentalist Islamic organisations, it's perfectly natural to my mind that they should be going to Aceh to participate in humanitarian relief. After all, Indonesia is their country.
The government has ruled out arming Australian troops in Aceh, saying it's satisfied with the protection provided by the Indonesian military.
The biggest international forensics operation in history is underway in Thailand as foreign experts help Thai authorities identify thousands of tsunami victims. Thailand is exhuming hundreds of bodies hastily buried after the tsunami. The Australian commander of a new victim identification centre in Phuket has warned the process could take up to 9 months to complete.
This field of numbered sticks marks the site of a graveyard, but the deceased do not rest in peace here. No one knows for sure just who is buried in this mass grave, and now the bodies are being dug up one by one. The heat, dust and stench make this grim task even more arduous. Hastily buried and crudely identified immediately after the tsunami, these corpses will be re-examined. Bundled on carts to and from refrigerated containers, it's another indignity for blameless victims of the cruelty of nature, but the only way to turn numbers into names.
They bring the bodies in on carts. It's absolutely horrific. So I've been here for 5 days and I haven't seen any break whatsoever in the bodies coming in and out.
Along Thailand's Khao Lak beach, the tsunami swamped hotels packed with foreign tourists. In the initial mayhem, there was a rush to dispose of decaying bodies and prevent disease. Fears that foreigners were mistakenly buried in mass graves forced another, closer look. Forensic experts from around the world have begun sifting through genetic data at a new victim identification centre set up in Phuket. And it's a task on an unprecedented scale.
It's certainly a world's first to set up a centre of this magnitude, to be using specialist staff and experts from all around the world to work as one team, to work together to try to identify these victims.
The confirmed tsunami death toll in Thailand is 5,309. Of that number, around 2,000 are yet to be identified, and more than 3,000 people are still listed as missing. Thai authorities have ordered DNA tests on all recovered and exhumed bodies. The new identification centre will act as a giant international database. cross-referencing DNA samples, dental records and fingerprints in a bid to match unidentified bodies to missing persons. But it's a long and laborious process that could take months. While other tsunami-ravaged countries with higher death tolls have abandoned hope of identifying many of their dead. In Indonesia, Sri Lanka and India, mass graves are likely to remain undisturbed.
Aid workers in countries affected by the tsunami are warning of a looming mental health crisis. They say many survivors have been deeply traumatized by their ordeal. Healing the psychological wounds, they say, will be a long process, particularly for the children who've been orphaned.
The first day of the new term at Sudama College in Galle. The town on Sri Lanka's south coast was devastated in the tsunami. It's thought as many as a third of the school's 1,200 students perished. The school day begins with a minute's silence. This girl says she's looking forward to going back to school. Some of her friends died, but she thinks all of her teachers survived. Her mother admits she's apprehensive because the school is so close to the sea. Many survivors have developed a phobia about the sea and say they'll never again feel comfortable being next to the ocean. Some are plagued by nightmares and panic attacks. Others show symptoms of anxiety and depression.